reverse Anna Karenina effect, as if you know the first line of Anna Karenina, where all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way, sort of thing. Well, I feel that it's the exact opposite in most software development organizations, in that the unhappy organizations are very similar to one another in terms of the symptoms that they portray and the behaviors that you observe. Another surprising thing was that it's not until you actually ask those questions that some of the things that people thought were really valuable turned out to be really not that valuable at all, or at least the impact of delaying that was actually really small. We changed sizing or guesstimates of complexity or duration or anything like that until we had a rough order of magnitude sort of value estimate. I see GenAI as a little bit of a catalyst for the ideas world. Like, you can sprinkle a bit of vibe coding into an idea and that will get you over that activation energy to the point where you can start to feel whether this is a real thing or not.
Welcome to the Tech Waka podcast, where we dive into the journeys of New Zealand's top tech leaders. Your host for today is Jakob, bringing you conversations with tech leaders and innovators from across Aotearoa. Join us as we uncover the experiences, challenges, and successes that shape our tech community.
Welcome to the Tech Waka podcast. In this episode, I speak with Joshua Arnold, an engineer turned product leader who has helped global organizations rethink how they build and prioritize software. We dive into the cost of delay, the power of value-first product thinking, and how GenAI is supercharging the way we prototype, test, and build. This episode of the Tech Waka podcast is proudly brought to you by Wires Uncrossed, lifting the standard of software delivery across New Zealand, Australia, and beyond. A big thanks to Wires Uncrossed for supporting the Tech Waka mission and backing the voices of our tech leadership community. To learn more, go to wiresuncrossed.co.nz. Hey Joshua, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. It's really great to have you here. We met a few years back and we had a number of really good catch-ups, and I was really glad that we could reconnect a couple of months ago and you agreed to be on the podcast. You have a rich experience in New Zealand organizations, but also outside. And maybe can you briefly give us an overview of what has shaped you and what has shaped how you think about technology and product?
Yeah, I'm an engineer by training, so I kind of bring that engineering mindset to all of the things that I do. But I probably spent more time in the product space. I certainly, on the tools itself, I know enough to be dangerous. Like, I wouldn't trust too much of the code that I write. But yeah, I certainly understand that world. But the bit that I probably focus more on has been more the product area, and mostly because it's the bit that I think is hard to get. And it's a lot of organizations sort of fall down the hole of building the wrong thing, or even worse, building the wrong thing faster. I think I've focused more on the product end of it to try to straighten out at that end. So, but yeah, I've been back in New Zealand now. It's been 10 years almost since I got back to New Zealand with a couple of kids in tow, from what was supposed to be a couple of years in the UK with my wife, and that turned into 13 years, 2 kids and a mortgage. And it wasn't until they were kind of, a year into school over there that we were kind of like, this is less than ideal. Well, let's head back to NZ. But I think the advantage that gave me is that I got exposure to quite, some interesting big companies, small companies, and I got to, get involved in some of the community stuff that happens over in Europe, which was really great. I had probably a couple of years of speaking at a whole bunch of conferences across Europe as well as the US, the big Agile conferences and Lean Kanban conferences across Europe. Yeah, so that was kind of a good opportunity to kind of meet with a bunch of people and still, what's the phrase? Iron sharpens iron, I think is the phrase. And so when you're sort of rubbing up against these other people who are kind of pushing the boundaries on, CI/CD or, the way we do, the way work flows and the way we organize things, those sorts of people kind of push you to kind of be a lot better. So the advantage of all of that. And then coming back to New Zealand and spending a bit of time out there in New Zealand, which I think is where we crossed paths for a little bit, crossed over a little bit there. But I probably spent more time in financial services the last 20 years at different banks of different hues. you know, the green ones and the blue ones, and all sorts of different banking situations, but also quite a bit in the sort of wealth tech space, to looking after in New Zealand the Kiwi saver world, and so I sort of understand that set up pretty well. What's holding that back and what's kind of pushing it forward. So yeah, and I think I've been kind of blessed with a bunch of good opportunities to learn some interesting things along the way and meet lots of interesting people like yourself.
Cool.
So
Thank you.
yeah.
When I think about you, and the first thing that comes to my mind is cost of delay, that I think I learned from our blog. That was the first time where I learned the concept, and I got really interested in your blog post and read it a couple of times and tried to apply cost of delay with a few teams I was coaching, and I never really got, I think, true chance to give it a go. And I think that many teams would benefit from understanding what it means and how to use it. So maybe if you could give us a brief overview of what it is and how it all fits into prioritization and working with product teams.
I think at a basic level, it sort of does what it says on the tin a little bit, in terms of like, you're trying to understand the cost of not having something, and obviously the longer you don't have something, that's costing you more over time. So it's a way of communicating the impact of time on the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. So basically, you're weirdly, whilst it's sort of named cost, it's actually about the value side of the equation, because it's the cost of not having that value over a longer period of time or a short period of time. So obviously that focuses on, in lean terms, the weight waste in terms of our ability to deliver, and therefore by not having that thing, people are getting frustrated, but they're also losing value as part of it. So it's an economic concept, and I got involved in this off the back of some work Don Reinertsen did. I can't even remember the years, but it's probably 2007, 2008, I think, where I first started picking up some of Don Reinertsen's work and starting to think how we could apply it into, software product. And Don first applied it more in the physical products world and manufacturing, developing a new product which is physical. And then in the sort of middle of the 2000s, we started to think about how we would apply that into software world, because obviously there's quite a big difference between the way you take a physical product to market and software products. And there's lots more opportunities for us to do early drops of valuable features in software world, which aren't really possible in a physical world, or at least it's very hard to iterate on a product once you've already sold it to someone. You can't really say, I'd like that back so I can add a new feature. So software world, we can do a lot more. And so we applied cost of delay to all of the work that we found at Maersk Line, the container shipping company. And we wrote a pretty long and slightly boring paper, an IEEE paper, that basically documented this case study of what we'd done at Maersk. And there were a couple of sort of surprising things in that experience. So the setting's kind of important, because the culture of Maersk, where I was, they're a Danish company, they're very numbers focused, they like their numbers, and they're not afraid of kind of like digging into them. It's quite similar to New Zealand in some respects. They don't have the New Zealand sort of passive aggressive thing. They're much more blunt in Scandinavia, but they're quite happy to sort of just ask the blunt question about where the value is, which I think in New Zealand we sort of dance around that question a lot and we kind of avoid it. So we basically applied this concept of cost of delay, and using cost of delay in an algorithm, CD3, cost of delay divided by duration, in order to prioritize the work across a whole portfolio of squads and teams, doing things from SAP configuration through to website stuff, through to the global container shipping system. I can talk about this in quite a bit of detail because we obviously published it. So one of the great things with Maersk is that they allowed us to make public the results. So it was very much a learning organization. I loved the time there. It was really good. Some of the insights that came from that were, it wasn't really as hard as you think it is. Once you start asking the questions about where the value is, we started to spot some patterns, especially across such a big portfolio of work. And there were really only 6 or 7 different patterns of calculations that you needed. You just had to push through the barrier of figuring out what those patterns were. And I did a bit of work on helping them to understand value from we had these sort of four buckets to try to identify where the value was, whether it was increasing revenue, sustaining revenue, reducing cost, or maintaining cost. And anything that you do could contribute to one or more of those buckets. So it sort of gave them some tools to kind of think about that made it a bit easier to quantify in dollar terms the value of the things that we were delivering. And a lot of it boiled down to small efficiencies scaled up to the size of Maersk Line, well, that's thousands of employees, turned out to be a lot of money. So there's, on one level, one of the learnings was it actually wasn't that hard once you push through that barrier of asking the difficult questions and establishing what those patterns were. Another surprising thing was that it's not until you actually ask those questions that some of the things that people thought were really valuable turned out to be really not that valuable at all, or at least the impact of delaying that was actually really small. And then there were other things which was like nobody's really paying attention to, but they turned out to be like incredibly valuable, millions of dollars a week for us to make this small change that was going to take 24 hours to make the change, but had been languishing in a backlog for months and months and months. And people were more focused on like the accuracy of the estimate, and getting that estimate more accurate cost them weeks of time, whereas they could have just made the change. Don't worry so much about whether it was going to cost this much plus or minus 50%, would have been neither here nor there, considering the value that was leaking away on a weekly basis. And it was seriously millions of US dollars per week that they were basically sitting on. So we wrote up to quite a bit of detail in this paper, which then got a little bit of attention from various folks in the community over in Europe, and it also got the attention of Kent Beck. And Kent Beck, one of the inventors of XP, and regularly blogs about these sorts of things, but he sort of read it twice, in fact, he said, and loved it. So that was kind of an interesting boost for the idea of it. Then went on to apply similar thinking at other organizations. I think I'm not saying it is something that every organization needs to do, but certainly having an understanding of it, I think it's more of a mindset thing than anything else. So as an example, where I'm working at the moment, which happens to be a bank, we want to understand the impact of making close account something we can achieve from the digital front end all the way through to the back end. Now that seems like it's pretty simple. I want to close an account. Like lots of banks have that. Maybe that's not that valuable. Like closing accounts, why would we need to do that? Like where's the value on that? Well, it wasn't until I kind of asked the question once or twice, might have been 3 times. It might have gotten a little bit annoying. But the numbers start flowing back in terms of like, we're actually burning thousands of minutes a month doing this manual process of closing an account, which is not super valuating for the customer. It's super painful for the operational staff. Like it's just a manual process that nobody wants to do, but it's surprising how valuable it is compared to the other things that they could have gone after. So I think just asking those uncomfortable questions and sort of getting to what's that actually worth? And in a lot of cases, depending on your organization, I think startup land is a bit different. You're chasing new revenue. So a lot of your patterns that you're going to spot with cost of delay are going to be focused on acquiring new customers, total lifetime value of those customers, those sorts of things, which you should know anyway as a startup. But you're very, very focused on the revenue side of the equation. So the buckets that you're kind of going after are more the increased revenue and protect revenue. The cost side of the equation, you're not that bothered about. Like if it costs us twice as much to build this thing, or if it's going to cost us twice as much to process this thing, that's less interesting than for us to grow a customer base. But depending on the organization, and certainly in a lot of financial services, the ability to straight through is quite valuable, even for mundane things like close an account. So I think for me now it's more of a kind of a mindset about how I approach the problem space, and I'm sort of hunting for value. And you do this process of just picking up rocks and looking at what's underneath them. And so as part of it, I'm always analyzing like what is the actual cost of delay of these various things. And some of them you'll lift up this rock and you'll be like, oh wow, there's diamonds under here basically. And the others will be way less. So one of the other things that we spotted with the Maersk numbers, where we had a full portfolio of, is that the distribution of value was very much non-linear. There was a power law curve between the sort of vital few, these tiny little numbers of super valuable things that only became obvious on asking the questions and getting to the numbers. And then there's this long tail of stuff which is all a bit meh, or it's kind of, it's good, but it's not going to light a fire under the company or anything like that. It's just, so yeah, that was one of the other kind of surprising things that came out of the use of cost of delay.
I think we spent quite a lot of time in product engineering teams talking about trying to estimate the effort or the cost of building something. But I don't think we spend enough time on talking about the value and trying to estimate the value. I think in the community, we focus so much on estimation effort, like assuming this is harder maybe than estimating value. Maybe that's what's coming up there. But
Yeah.
it's really interesting how having tools like cost of delay or CD3 can
Yeah.
help us actually switch the conversation to let's talk about value first and maybe later about effort, if at all.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, before I even got to Maersk, when we were applying it was Pearson Education where I was first starting to do this, we changed the process around. So actually we wouldn't estimate. We wouldn't do any sort of sizing or guesstimates of complexity or duration or anything like that until we had a rough order of magnitude sort of value estimate. And it's amazing how if you stage gate the asking of the question about how big it is by front-footing it with, well, we want you to sort of capture what this thing is, write it down a little bit because that'll help you think about it. But also, we really want to know what the value is in dollar terms. So don't just give us out what's super valuable to the company. Oh, this is a strategic imperative. Like, that's not good enough. You need to actually say how much this is worth to us. And it's not that it's all about money, because obviously you're delighting customers or, getting great customer experiences, those sorts of things, probably better things to focus on. That's probably the higher order bit. It's merely that focusing on the dollar value of the things gives you an even playing field between all of the different options. You can actually compare like for like. It's just a useful way of of doing that fair comparison. I would say for any organization that's doing some level of estimation of size or complexity or duration, I would say you should probably think about spending at least that same amount of time, even if it was the same. That would be better than what most organizations do. Most organizations spend almost no time on the value side of the equation and then spend a lot of time on what is effectively uncertainty around how big the thing is. Even on the duration side, we are kind of guessing and we think it's going to be this. And it's not until you get into the complexity of the work that you discover, there's this edge case we hadn't thought of. And there's this unhappy path over here that we also need to build. And we've got to handle that case over there. And if we're going to do this properly, we really need to refactor this part of the code as well. Or, it's not until you actually start to unpack it and do it that you actually kind of discover how big that thing is. So I feel like I think it's Parkinson's law that sort of, says that, that we have this complexity around how long something takes. And I just wish we'd spend as much time, give it equal footing, and then maybe we'd make some better decisions along the way. So yeah, cost of delay is a concept. I think it's important to separate the two, like cost of delay, and then there's the prioritization algorithm, which is, in my world, CD3, cost of delay divided by duration. The idea that you would prioritize just on cost of delay is not true because not everything takes the same amount of time. So therefore you really need some sense of the size of it. So I'm certainly not in the, quote unquote, no estimates camp. I understand the value of getting a rough size of what the thing is before you set off, because maybe it's going to take you 10 years and you're never going to get there. So maybe that's not a good thing to build, So we need some rough idea of how big it is. But I usually guide people towards, a t-shirt size, is this days or weeks or months or quarters worth of work? That's enough. That's enough in terms of the accuracy for most organizations, I would say. At least I'm yet to come across one where they really need or can achieve better accuracy or better precision, I think is the word, than is this days worth of work, or is it weeks worth of work, or is it months worth of work, or is it quarters worth of work? That's kind of the level that I'm looking for most of the team I'm working with.
And would you do it
Yeah.
on a, let's say, feature level, or more like a grouping of features, portfolio level? Can you do it on every
Yeah.
level? Like what's most useful? Or if people are starting, where would you start?
It's a really good question. So I've applied it at, across a whole portfolio at
Mm-hmm.
feature level, and I understand it can feel like a lot of work. I think the thing is it's a little bit like riding a bike. Like, yeah, the first few times you get on the bike, it's going to feel very weird, and you might fall over and get a few bumps and scrapes and those sorts of things. But after a while, you'll sort of get used to it, and then you'll realize how much faster you are on the bike. I just encourage people to sort of start and maybe just choose something that is, you know, maybe start bigger, and then if you find it useful to get smaller in terms of granularity, then great. But I'd say a lot of the value is probably more at the level at which things can actually be used by a customer. So whether that's at feature level or maybe, a deployable piece, some sort of MVP for the phone, so slightly level it up a little bit. I do think I wrote a long piece on, how you apply CD3 and prioritization at scale about how you sort of start with your strategic outcomes. If you can't put a value figure on your strategic outcomes, then something's horribly wrong. So start at that sort of level, allow your teams to then generate options about how they could move the needle towards achieving those outcomes. And they don't have to achieve those outcomes 100%. They could be like, well, we think this is going to shift the needle 5% or 10% towards a particular target that we've already quantified. So that can be a way of sort of doing it. And then once you've got the options, then do the rough sizing, divide one by the other, and you've got CD3 at the local level, which is where you need it.
And you mentioned at the beginning that you had a chance to work outside of New Zealand and you moved back a few years back. And you probably have an opinion now about how, or even compare the tech and product communities and approach to building products in kind of outside of New Zealand and in New Zealand. How would you describe the differences and what could we learn from that?
Yeah, like a lot of countries, it's not evenly distributed. There are some companies and organizations who are doing, amazing work and, have really pushed, they kind of applied all the best practice, good practice sort of stuff, and probably have pushed the thinking even further in some areas, which I think is great. But I think there's a lot of mediocre, and that I feel like New Zealand in general has this kind of, we're a little bit afraid to be different. We feel like we want to do what we think everyone else is doing rather than testing and learning on our own. And unfortunately, some of what I think, some of the preferences of what has been applied in New Zealand has probably been some of the wrong things, So, yeah, there's probably a few cases where, SAFE has been picked up and applied in New Zealand, even though it was fairly roundly criticised elsewhere. And there's lots of material about the drawbacks of a model like SAFE. But there's still lots of organisations who'll pick that up and think that that's the safe thing to do because it's this big organisation that basically runs training. I can just double click and install it and it'll work, So I feel like there's a little bit of copy to New Zealand, but not always the good stuff. It's, some of the not so good stuff. So I felt like that probably held us back a little bit. I think the first principles for a lot of these things are available to us. It's not like you need to copy the method when you can get the underlying thinking and sort of apply it from first principles, make it your own, apply it to your context. And, as you'll know from various organizations, context is king. No two organizations are the same. They've got completely different tech. They'll have different cultures. They'll have different product spaces, different customer problems that they're going after, different competitor situations. So, the idea that there's this one model that sort of fits all of them is clearly not right. But I have also sort of remarked that I think I've dubbed it the kind of the reverse Anna Karenina effect, as if the first line of Anna Karenina, where all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way, sort of. Well, I feel that it's the exact opposite in most software development organizations, in that the unhappy organizations are very similar to one another in terms of the symptoms that they portray and the behaviors that you observe. So I can walk into an organization and I can, after a week of talking to a few people and having a bit of a sniff around, you can pretty much quickly get to and are you having this problem? And they're like, yeah, we are. How did you know that? It's like, because yes, it's exactly the same as this one over here. So it's kind of like, I think the pockets of goodness are different to one another. Like there are lots of different ways to do product well, but it seems to be all of the ways to do product badly. Everyone seems to fall into the same bad patterns, the same potholes, the same they fall down the same crack, which is kind of sad to watch. I think I'd want New Zealand to be a little bit more. I mean, there's definitely some pockets of great stuff, like the product community in Auckland at least, and I think elsewhere in New Zealand is pretty strong. And Anthony Mart has done a great job of looking after and nurturing that community. So there's definitely good stuff happening in that space. But I just think there's more that we could do, basically. And some of that is better learning from each other. Some of that is taking good learnings from overseas. Some of that's applying first principles and adapting it to your context.
I wonder how much of this is because we don't have much exposure to other countries, other ways of doing things, because at the end of the day we are quite a small country, and unless you travel abroad you don't really get a chance to experience different ways of maybe thinking.
But we do have a very strong concept of the OE, the idea of going and working overseas for some period of time. Is I think New Zealand does that better than a lot of
that's true
cultures. And a lot of them, like myself, we come back with a boatload of learning about what works and what doesn't in different cultures. There's a very weird kind of like you need to have New Zealand experience in New Zealand, which is seemed a bit backwards to me. There's nothing particularly special about the way companies operate in New Zealand. I mean, yes, we do an extremely good passive aggressive. That's something we do have, but business isn't fundamentally different in New Zealand. We do have a lot of small companies. That's definitely a thing, but we want to see those companies grow. So it'd be nice to see some of that overseas experience and learning sort of coming to bear, and be a bit more judicious about picking the good stuff from the bad stuff. Let's see if we can do that to push New Zealand forward.
Yeah, the Kiwi experience is certainly a thing. When I moved here over 10 years ago, I remember that was learning that was important was a bit of a shock, especially for my wife, who couldn't really find a job for a few months, and that was her feedback she got a few times. She would get the last interview and the feedback was, well, but the other candidate had Kiwi experience. She was like, how can I get Kiwi experience if you're not hiring me? I will never get the chance to even get the experience because I have never worked here. And, she did.
But it's also just not that valuable.
Yeah.
I just don't get why that would be a key focus.
And maybe actually you want someone who doesn't have the experience so that they can break what's happening in your organization and help you make a change. Quite often when we talk about hiring, I quite often talk about hiring for culture add instead of culture fit. So trying to figure out how you want to change your culture, and not just hire someone who can fit, but actually who can help you change the culture into the direction you want to change it.
Exactly.
So something like this could be useful just to take into account. Yeah,
100%. Don't really know how to fix that other than what you've just said. Yes.
Yeah, and especially that we, as humans, when we hire, we usually hire people like ourselves because we like ourselves. So we just look for people like us, who think like us, who are like us. So
we have this bias to the familiar.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally. So if someone repeats in an interview what we already believe, we like that because they are like us. So we're going to hire them. And if you want to you bring some change into your company, it's if you're gonna hire the same people, you're not gonna see that change.
Yeah, you'll get the same thing.
Another topic that is probably on the top of minds of everyone in tech right now and outside of tech, and we briefly talked about this a few weeks ago when we caught up for coffee, and we talked about AI changing product development and what it means for us, and what have you been observing and thinking in that space?
I think it's pretty exciting, to be honest. So I'm less fearful about it because I'm probably old enough to have seen a few waves of, if we do this, then we won't need developers anymore. We won't need tech, We'll just be writing our own apps. I suspect a little bit like the advent of the digital camera, it led to an explosion of, we take way more photos than we ever have in history. So I suspect that actually these tools will end up producing a lot more software, which will then need to be maintained, upgraded, rewritten, all those sorts of things. So I think there's going to be a lot more software. So that's certainly one bit of it. So I definitely think there are some productivity efficiency gains to be had, but I think the demand side of the equation is going to also increase to the point where the supply side just won't be able to keep up still. So I don't really see that changing. But I think for product in particular, there's sort of I've written about this a while back where I sort of talked about the evolution of the BA role and software. And yeah, this is another one of those slightly weird things about New Zealand. Like a lot of teams overseas don't have BAs anymore, but I can barely get started on a piece of work in New Zealand before someone says, "Oh, we need a BA on this." I'm like, "What? Why would we need a BA?" Yeah. So I think the BA role has kind of evolved over time to the point where it's sort of blended into more QA and product sort of end of the scales. So it's sort of gone into other areas more. And I think with the advent of GenAI and the ability to whip up these little prototypes that kind of can prove out an idea a lot quickly, I think that's going to basically put the product discipline on steroids. I can see 1,000 flowers blooming basically with these sort of tools, because you can go from random idea in the shower to a working prototype, way less effort. And I think there's definitely a barrier, almost like an activation energy, the size of the catalyst required in order to create that reaction for a chemical reaction to sort of take off. Well, I think that I see Gen AI as a little bit of a catalyst for the ideas world. Like you can sprinkle a bit of vibe coding into an idea, and that will get you over that activation energy to the point where you can start to feel whether this is a real thing or not. Like, is there any value? To come back to the value side of the equation for a second, I think we'll be able to prove out whether something is valuable or not much faster. So I feel like the product discipline is going to be on steroids, and we haven't even really seen the beginning of that at this point. But with that on steroids, that will actually cause an explosion of the need for more software development. I don't think it's going to go away. So even if for argument's sake, let's say that, with Copilot and all of the tooling that's now sitting in the IDE for developers these days, which takes a lot of the drudgery out. Let's say you could, for argument's sake, 10x the productivity of developers. Well, I think the demand side of the equation is probably going to see the same or more explosion. And not only that, but it's not like it's a productivity gain that is exclusive to one or two organizations who have a monopoly on it. Like, we've all got access to it. So it's kind of going to be the new norm, and through competition, we'll all need to have it. And so basically, I just think the pace of change in software world and product development world is just going to accelerate. And hopefully we'll get some better products out of it. Having played with it quite a bit myself, I can definitely see the power, and I can also see the pain. There's going to be a lot of shitty code out there for us to tidy up down the road. But if it's good enough to prove a product out, for us to then get the tech and behind it working better, then that's not necessarily a bad. If it sort of shortens that feedback loop to, is this valuable or not, that's got to be a great thing. So I feel like this is, the whole bicycle for the mind that the computer gave
Mm-hmm.
us. I feel like GenAI is kind of like the bicycle for a lot of what we do, especially in software world, because it's just so applicable. If your developers aren't experimenting with GenAI right now, your competitors are probably starting to put a bit of get a bit of a lead on you. So I feel like there's going to be some pressure to kind of do that. So I mean, there's obvious applications of it already. This isn't like crypto, where there was, or blockchain, where there was a lot of buzz about blockchain for years and years and years, but not a lot of actual genuine products that were meaningful and valuable. Not every registry requires a blockchain. We don't actually want distributed databases all over the place. But this is not like that. This is much more exciting where this could take us. I also am bothered by the ethics of it, and I can definitely see the bad actors making use of these tools. And I've got elderly parents who are easily fooled, perhaps, by click on this link and, your iPhone that you ordered hasn't been delivered. Click on this link. They're easily fooled by that sort of stuff. Well, those sorts of scams then get more and more harder to spot.
Yeah.
So I fear for the nation state actors are going to start dealing with it. So I can certainly see a bunch of downsides as well. But yeah, in general, I think I'm bullish about what this can do for us. So I'm excited to see where this goes. Yeah. How about yourself? What are you?
I like to approach it with the abundance mindset. The more we create, basically, the more all we can kind of get value from. So I try to embrace it in this situation as well. And what you said about there's going to be more bad code. Yes, I agree. But also humans are not guaranteed for good code. And I think
this is true.
There is this bias when you compare humans' performance and AI is, again, probably that's the bias. We like people like ourselves. It's similar here that whenever we are much more tolerating humans' errors and mistakes, but we don't tolerate AI mistakes. We just expect AI and computers to not make mistakes. But if human make a mistake, we have all of the reasons to believe, no, they had good intentions, but this happened and this and this and this and this. And objectively, humans make more mistakes actually than machines, right?
Yes.
So I think, yes, AI brings this element of hallucination, probably before you'd not expect from a computer. Computer was zeros and ones, and it would always give you the correct, or almost always give you the correct answer. And maybe that changes a bit. Maybe we need to adjust our expectations. But I don't think it's
non-deterministic.
Fair. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
The non-deterministic nature of it, I think, will force us to kind of take a different approach to it. But what delights me on one level is that it actually encourages us to double down on some of the basic underlying principles that we know work in software development. So, for instance, using test-driven development as a way of kind of like achieving a better structure to your code and, well tested along the way, I think that's going to be even more important. And I can't remember who said it. It might have been Kent Beck or one of those guys who said, if you're given the choice between, throwing away all of your tests or all of your code, you should choose to throw away all of your code because you should be able to recreate all of your code from the tests accurately. And what I'm looking forward to is a world where someone actually tests that hypothesis by building up a nice code base with tons of extremely good quality test coverage wrapped around it. And then for us to actually feed all of those unit tests into our GenAI and have the GenAI basically use that whole test suite as a way of recreating the code from scratch, and perhaps in a better way than the original code, to your point around humans infallible. So I kind of look forward to running an experiment like that someday and just seeing how that pans out. I think in general, like it encourages us to put those guardrails in place, the same guardrails that keep developers and teams and squads and organizations safe will also keep the GenAI So,
Yeah.
like it's actually the same principles will be even more required in this brave new world that we've entered into. So to use a little Aldous Huxley there.
Yeah.
But I think it is kind of exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see
Let's see
how
how
it
it
pans
goes.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Joshua. I really enjoyed that
Not at all.
conversation. Thanks for sharing your experiences and your skills. And
Not at all.
maybe we could meet again in a few months' time and see how it all
Yeah.
evolves and what you can learn from all of the AI and other changes and have another
Yeah.
chat. Thank you so much.
For sure. Not at all. Good chat. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Tech Waka. If this conversation sparked ideas or helps shift your perspective, go on, share it with your colleague or friend. Big thanks to Joshua for such an insightful and inspiring discussion. Don't forget to subscribe and stay curious. Cheers. A special thanks to our sponsor, Wires Uncrossed, helping teams across New Zealand, Australia and beyond untangle software delivery and build systems that truly perform. We're grateful for their support in making these conversations possible. Check them out at wiresuncross.co.nz.